Hi everyone, I'm Tim Bermudez Sanders. I'm the founder of Change the Stage, and welcome back to our our third Change the Stage discussion with Sebastián Alberdi and James Montaño. If you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sebastián Alberdi. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am primarily a playwright, but for my day job, I am also the literary associate at the Huntington Theater Company, as well as a dramaturg there. I'm originally from San Diego, been in Boston for like 6 years now, and I'm excited to be on this panel. Thanks for having me, Tim.
And I'm James Montaño. I identify with he, him, his pronouns. And I would say in my life, I would consider myself a dramaturg primarily. On the side, I do some playwriting. I also, write music for shows and stuff like that. But primarily right now, my gig is dramaturgy and some criticism on the side. I'm originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I have been in Boston, I would say, about the same amount of time. I'd say about 6 years or plus. Currently doing freelance dramaturgy, but for the last few years, I've been working at the American Repertory Theater and also as an educator at Harvard as well.
All right, so let's dive in, shall we? I'm going to start off with this question. What are some recent shows that strike you as exemplary of where the industry should be headed in terms of what stories we tell and how we tell them?
Yeah, I was actually thinking about this today, and something that I hadn't thought about like a few days ago when we were talking about this the first time was How to Defend Yourself by Lily Padilla. I saw it at Humana about a year ago, and it kind of blew me away. It was it's sort of this play about like self-empowerment. It's sort of set in a self-defense class, and it's about sexual assault culture on campus, like rape culture on campus, and it's also about like the ways that we socialize men and women, or even just like little girls and little boys, because that's all sort of society sees, when raising kids, and the ways that we sort of affect them in their whole life, just the ways that we, talk to them, the things that we get them, all that stuff. And it kind of just blew me away. And something that I really loved about it is that one of the main characters is Mexican-American, and, the play is about sexual assault and like living on a college campus and dealing with the things that college students deal with, while also not like trying to be like, oh, she's not Mexican American. It was a really awesome blend of it not being like a trauma play in terms of like cultural trauma, like or racial trauma, I mean, not cultural, while also dealing with all these, I don't know. I'll just say that play is wonderful. If you haven't read it, please read it. I've been trying to get someone in Boston to do it for like so long because it's brilliant. And I hope to see it everywhere one day.
Yeah, that's exciting. I've heard of it. I've heard really good things about it. I haven't seen it yet, though. Sounds great. I would say for me, we talked about this a little bit, but it is something that still stands out to me. I think it was the beginning of this season or early in the season. Huntington had Quixote Nuevo, and not to toot Sebastian's horn here, but I thought it was so good. That's you helped with it. You didn't write. That was definitely Octavio Solis, I think his name is.
Yeah, Octavio Solis. Yeah, Solis.
Gosh, it was such an impressive production. I had so much fun. I didn't really know what to expect outside of course, the kind of Don Quixote narrative. But coming from the Southwest and coming specifically from New Mexico, and a family who identifies primarily, I would say, as like Hispanic Chicano, there was so much Chicano-ness built into this piece that it felt for the first time in a very long time that something was just speaking to me in my own language, which I hear of that, I've heard of people having that experience, being able to see a piece that really resonates with their experience of being whatever identity that they are. And in the years of theater, this is the first time that I actually got to share in that, I would say, that it was something about the fact that it's happening in Boston, and that it was so clearly a border play and so clearly, it was like incredibly produced. I just thought, I appreciated that the there was not only great thought into the narrative, great thought into the performances, but really it was expensive. I know it sounds like such a crazy thing, but it's not something that you get the sense of with a lot of the work that I get to see from Latinx theater makers. It's small and scrappy, and it's because sometimes we're given only small spaces and scraps. But it was incredible to see a work that had money behind it and an investment and some real thought behind it. So I that piece just like I still think about a lot to this day. So I'm very, very happy to have seen that.
Yeah, and that was just to give Hartford Stage and the Alley some credit too. That was a co-production between all three of us. So it was really a lot of theaters and a lot of people really believing in that show, which is just awesome. I also just want to, sorry.
No,
I just want to make a, no, go. I'm not going to talk. You go, please.
I was just going to say you could feel that there was like a lot of heart and energy and thought into it. And that was something that I just loved about it. Sorry.
No. Mine was not about Quixote, so I'm glad that you got to say that. I also just want to do a quick shout out to the Fefu and her friends that I saw at Theater for a New Audience in Brooklyn earlier last year, I think. I mean, Maria Irene Fornes is such a genius and such an inspiration to me and to like every playwright that you like know of contemporarily right now, I feel like, you know, like she taught Luis Alfaro and Octavio Solis actually, and like Paula Vogel and Sarah Rule, and just like all these playwrights, some Latinx, some not, that just, you know, cite her as an inspiration. And that play was just kind of mind-blowing to see it in production, and it feels like something that it was so risky, you know, like it's such a difficult play to pull off, but the fact that people are taking that chance and hiring like directors of color and like a mostly a cast of color to tell that story and to just knock it out of the park felt really affirming. And like I left that show being like, I'm really glad I'm in this field. I'm really glad that I'm writing plays. Like I'm glad that this is the tradition that I'm in. So yeah.
That's great.
Kind of on the flip side of that question, are there any pieces that we need to retire, things that are too regressive or problematic in their content to be salvaged in a meaningful way?
Ooh. Good question.
Controversial question for sure.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting because you have someone who works in the literary office, so has a little bit more power over that. Right. And I tend to think of this a little bit as a dramaturg / educator, because as an educator, you are also, you know, choosing what to expose your students to, you know, young playwrights or young actors. And so that is a thought, because it, you know, I'm not in a place personally where I can decide what gets on stages at this moment in my life. But gosh, I really struggle with it. I really struggle with this question. I think the one thing I would say about it is we tend to, I think there's an approach in theater where we think of it as we're coming at a place from lack, right? We're coming at a place of, we only have so many spaces in a theater to put on a show. So that means who do we put on and who do we let go of? And I think sometimes that's where we get into some sticky questions, because I don't know if there's always like I generally think we should stop producing this person. I mean, I have people in my head that I would gladly, you know, like never see another play from. But equally, I actually think as an educator, it's important to teach a little bit of it too, because you got to talk about where we're going. And the only way to talk about where we're going is where we've been. And so I'm not, the educator part of me thinks we do need to expose a few small things to our students. We need to give them the room to be able to acknowledge what is stuff that feels regressive, what is the stuff that feels like it excludes certain voices. And I think there's plenty of that kind of work out there. But in terms of people, like if there was an option for me to program a theater and I was an artistic director and, you know, someday big dream, that's like a big goal of mine. I would say that it's not a matter of me getting rid of certain people. It's me of deciding who to highlight in terms of voices. When we start talking about who to stop playing and who to stop putting on stage or whose plays to stop, you know, producing, what we're actually saying many times is artistic directors, listen, these are people we don't like anymore. And that's fine. Like, I think there's a good debate that should happen there, but I actually think it's more of like, artistic directors, listen, these are the people whose voices who should be heard right now. And maybe in that case, in that way, we can stop kind of playing all the same like old white males, straight white males who have been played forever and ever, amen, you know.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, James, about like, while maybe like we shouldn't produce certain people, like I think people should still be exposed to like these artists and these plays that like we now, for whatever reason, find problematic or regressive or offensive. Like the play that I'm like thinking about, like someone who I would easily never want to see another play of his stage is like David Mamet. Like, hell no, like I don't want to pay for that. I'm not interested, and I'm just gonna say it and to whatever. But like something like a story that I find interesting about that is like at the Huntington, we did The Niceties by Eleanor Burgess, and a lot of people compared it to Oleana, and we were like, yeah, like it actually is a response to that play. Like we know, like don't worry, we know that she didn't just like plagiarize, like she didn't plagiarize this basically. And like I think there is an interesting conversation to be had with these past pieces. And I think a lot of those conversations sometimes are really bad and like not interesting. I think that people like do a Shakespeare play and they're like, oh, I'm gonna do this really interesting thing with it, and like sometimes it's actually not interesting and it's probably worse. Like Taming of the Shrew with all men, like that's not gonna do anything.
Right.
And you're just like excluding women from like Shakespearean roles, which like they're already dealing with weird shit in those roles anyway. Like they're used to it, which isn't a good thing, but you know what I'm saying. But like, yeah, I don't know. I think it's hard for me to say like these are the plays that we should retire, because I also think people today are making plays that I hate and that I find offensive and regressive and like shouldn't exist. So like it's not really like, I think it's going to be something that's always happening. You know, there's always going to be someone who writes a play that I wish had not made it on the stage, but there's only so much you can do other than being like, well, I'm gonna, you know, try harder next time and be like, this is why I don't like this play, this is why we shouldn't do it. And sometimes people listen and sometimes don't, and that's something that you know, has been an experience I've had working at the Huntington. So yeah, I think it's hard to just like pick out specific things, but I think it's an interesting question, and I think I honor the like feelings of people really hating a play and being like, this is really offensive and I hate it, and like it made me feel like uncomfortable, and it like hurt me in a way. So yeah, it's complicated, and I don't have an easy answer except that I don't want to see Mamet on stage.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, and one more thing I'd add to that. I think that's great. I totally agree with that, and I also think that once the nature of theater and the nature of at least the written dramatic text is that we're going to see works. You know, Shakespeare, you're going to see Shakespeare done over and over and over again. And what you pointed at, which is a great example, is that these may be fine plays, but much of what we do in theater is also about interpretation. And so I have seen interpretations of plays that I think are okay, that have turned the play into being something that I found offensive and bothersome and just bad overall. And that's one of the other elements that like, then we start getting into, should this director not work anymore? Should like, and I feel like that's when we start getting to like sticky territory overall. I agree. I think that's a really interesting point. There's going to be plenty of things over this time, over years and years of seeing theater that we're going to disagree or dislike. I think this is where this minor situation of, sorry, I'm going to get some loud stuff outside. When we have power to take advantage of that and to highlight the voices that we can at that time. I think it's all we can do. Right.
So that actually segues pretty well into the next question. You're talking about power. So like, in your opinion, where should we be focusing that power when we are given it to create the greatest change in the industry? Is that in literary works? Is that in who's behind the scenes?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this because, you know, I feel like we need so much change in the industry. So I was like trying to think of like, how can I answer this in a way that I'm not just like saying random things that I might not know about. Like, because I think something that happens in theater a lot is that people get frustrated for very good reasons, but like what I hate about theater sometimes is that we're so like not transparent about what's happening behind the scenes. So like people are like, oh, they're doing this and I can't believe they're doing that. I'm really mad about it. And like they have a point, but like they also don't realize that like maybe they already asked like 8 directors to direct and all of them couldn't do it with the time, and like they had to do this director who like might not be the best fit for the play, but like it was either that or not doing the play in the first place. So like I think those things are complicated. But I think a way that I was thinking about this for myself was like thinking about how everyone individually, depending on their role in the theater, can create change in their field. So I was thinking of how I can hopefully create change in the industry as a playwright. And you know, as a playwright, and I feel like every playwright sort of says this, like I am interested in creating roles and writing stories that feature people who, you know, historically are underrepresented on the stage or ignored. And for me, that is like queer Latinx people. Like that's sort of the interest. Those are the actors, and those are the people that I'm interested in uplifting and giving roles. And I think that creates a ripple effect of then letting me also work with a lot of Latinx, some of who are queer, some who are not, directors who are then able to hire more actors. And you sort of spread the wealth around that way and like create this community where you're helping everyone build up their own career and everyone to be able to help these people out. So that's one way that I think about it as a playwright. But also, you know, as a literary associate at the Huntington, like, you know, I don't have all that much power in terms of like what goes on our stage, but I think it is about, you know, pointing out, you know, something that I try to do is I try to point out when like we are doing something and it's like, oh, this season looks like very, very white. Like, you know, like it wouldn't make sense to actually do that show. Like, I know that would be easy, but like maybe we should look at something else. And, you know, sometimes people listen, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there are reasons that they can't listen, and, you know, we just have to deal with that, unfortunately. I hate that. Like, that sounds awful. Like, we just have to deal with it. But sometimes it feels easier than the alternative sometimes, which is a whole nother problem in the arts. So yeah, those are ways that I am thinking about creating change in the industry, but I mostly try to think of it as what am I doing in my plays? What am I doing in my work? How can I uplift directors, actors, dramaturgs who I believe in and who historically are underrepresented in the field?
Thank you for that. That's really good. Yeah, I think that's the core thing that I get challenged by, is that idea of like, I think what you were hitting at right at the beginning of like, who are we in this question, right? Who are the we in this moment? And I think like, if I'm very much thinking about myself in this moment as part of the we, I think in my place, you know, as a dramaturg, I can do my best to encourage voices that aren't seen as often on stage. I do every so often like script coverage for theaters. So I try to find work that I think is not only speaking to an experience that I just don't see very often on stage, but also voices that I don't know this playwright. This would be great to open a door for. So similarly in that way, I think like the we of what we can do at this moment is basically highlighting as many other voices as possible, but also, and this is kind of this I think is like the biggest thing, is really starting to take consideration about what space you are taking in whatever environment you're in. Really thinking about, is my voice heard in this process? I think one of the things I definitely heard at the tail end of what you were saying, Sebastian, is like, there's a system in place in which it's really challenging to figure out when is the exact right time to speak up and when isn't. I mean, if we really went with the, I don't know, the kind of like academic energy or the energy that we see on Twitter, it's speak up right away and don't let anyone talk down to you. Not practical all the time in the real world. And also not the best way to work in a theatrical community environment. That's just not how things work. So I think in that respect, there is a way in which the only thing I can really do that's maybe not just elevating other voices is to make sure that at least my voice is heard, that at least people hear me. And I think one of the things I would say early on at my time at ART, where I'm not with them anymore, so I can kind of say this, but early on in my time, I felt like I wasn't not just not heard, but also not willing to speak up. So it was like this double problem, right? And then I'd look around and be like, well, when is someone going to give you the opportunity? Nobody's going to give you the opportunity. You at some point just speak up, and you figure out a way to do it in a way that's respectful, in the tone of that everyone else speaks, in the language that they speak. And you then use that platform to start pointing out the when you can, when it makes sense, the like deficiencies on the stage, the deficiencies behind the stage, the like just the people who work for the organization, like why are our hiring practices this way? And using that platform that you have at that moment in your life in a way that is effective. So the we, I think at this moment in this particular question is going to change constantly, and it's going to change as like all of our careers grow, and we kind of find ourselves in different rooms. And then when we're in that room, that's when we figure out how to navigate and lift up other voices, as well as take whatever space we feel we need to take in order to make that one lone Latinx voice, which tends to be the case in my situation, that one Latinx voice speak up. Right. Yeah, I think that's the only thing I can do at this moment.
And I think something that is also just inherent, unfortunately, is that change is slow, like very slow, like painfully slow. And I think one of the things that we can do, and it's something that we were sort of talking about in the chat we sort of had before this, of like getting like not people who are not white into these artistic director positions and into these like casting director positions, and getting them into these positions where like like there's only so much you can do from the bottom. Like that's the truth. Like it sucks and it's like bleak, but I think we need to be focusing our energy on uplifting people and helping them get to the next level of their career, so that they can then help other people keep coming up. So I think that's any way that we can do that is helpful. Any way that we can uplift people who, I'm specifically thinking about Latinx people because that's sort of what the talk is about, but anyone will be so beneficial for whatever the rest of our time. Like going back to Quixote for like a hot second, like I sometimes, and this is not like a Huntington exclusive problem or issue, but like I feel like sometimes people are afraid, especially in the Northeast, to do Latinx stories because like the audience won't come, and like, oh no, like we're gonna lose all this money. And like, of course, money, we need it to stay open, but I feel like a lot of people use that as an excuse to then not do it. And then like it's like, well, it's never gonna happen if you don't start building this up right now. Like we need to start building it up slowly, so that 4 years, 5 years, 6 years from now, like we will be seen as a theater that actually does support Latinx voices, and like people will trust us to tell these stories, and the Latinx community will want to come to the theater and feel comfortable in our spaces. So I think that's another thing of just like taking the very first step into change can really, really grow into something exponential in like 6 or 8 or 10 years or however long.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I'll say, that one of the ways in which we do see Latinx people stepping into theatrical spaces is many times, especially if you're looking at kind of the behind the scenes stuff, is you have a lot of interns and a lot of people who are coming in as like, fellows or associates. And in those positions, it's very hard to kind of see a place in which your voice can be heard effectively, especially if your fellowship is like timed out at a certain point, right? You only have 2 years to make as much impact as possible, and it's a scary thing. It's a very difficult thing, because it's you have a certain voice and you have a certain job, and it's challenging. One of the things that I noticed during my time that was like helpful though, and I think this is a really powerful point that you're talking about, which is like building a base and encouraging the theater to think about how we build a base, because this is one of the big complications, right? It's how do we bring people into the theater who don't want to see a Latinx story, but then if we don't do Latinx stories, we just don't see Latinx people. So then if we only invite them during these Latinx shows, so the one thing I will commend for sure Huntington for doing is by highlighting, I think it was, is her name Melissa Lopez, is that her name? So playwright who is
Melinda Lopez.
Melinda Lopez, thank you.
Yeah.
She's last few years has been having new works that have kind of, and Huntington, I would say almost every season has had one Latinx play in the last like 4 years, maybe 3 or 4 years. So Yerma was last season, and they've been very conscientious about building an audience slowly. That's the way you do it. That's the only way you do it. It's you kind of keep people. You don't just reach out to the Latinx community when you need them to buy tickets. You make them know that this is a part of your home. And I think that's one small area that we can make a difference in, is like encouraging theaters to keep going in that direction. To say like, no, that community, they're gonna come. They're gonna keep coming. If you consider them valuable, they will consider you an asset as well. And yeah, I think that's one of the only ways that can happen.
Yeah, and something really quick, something that you're saying, like, don't just invite this community for this play about their like community issues, like invite them for every play in the season. Like, you can't just like be like, we want you in the theater for this play, but like don't come to this one, which like,
right.
You know, I feel like it's an easy thing to like mess up on. Not that it's a mess up, it's like it's more sinister than that, than a mess up, but you know, it's something that I think people overlook sometimes, and it's like, no, you can't do that.
Yeah, it's at the core of it. It's one of the challenges with the framing of outreach. This idea that we are reaching out. You would be lucky to come and see our show, when in fact that is. I think that's one. I think this is a little off our topic, but that is something that I think about in terms of how I think of community functioning at all. That is not how communities are built, and so I think that's one thing we can do, is also like build up communities. How do we build communities?
Right. So something that because Sebastián, you were talking specifically about uplifting queer Latin people, and we're kind of, we're in, that's kind of, that's part of what I wanted to bring us together to talk about, because like we all come from that identity. So what do you have to say to younger queer artists who are struggling with that identity at home or in their work?
I'm not gonna quote Dan Savage because I hate Dan Savage personally, but like it does get better, like actually. And I think something that was super, something that was really important to me was like owning my art. Like back when, like I just came out of the closet to like my family. Like I've been out to the closet to like a lot of my friends, and like everyone since like 8th grade. But like my family knew, but like I hadn't said it. But like I told them, I think. Like it must have been like 2 years ago now, and I'm 25, so I was like 23. I was like done with college. Like it was after that, and sort of what made me want to do it is that I was finally getting some traction with my work. Like it wasn't just me being like isolated in the room and like sending out stuff and getting rejections. Because when that was happening and I was just working on my plays and it wasn't going out to the public, like it was easier to be closeted in terms of being an artist, but like once I got to the point where I was like, oh, I actually need to like start marketing myself a little bit and like telling people that this is happening. And like everyone uses Facebook to do that. And like my family's on Facebook, and it gets so exhausting to like hide from your family, like the specific posts, like exhausting. So I kind of was like, I need to just tell them, I need to come out, I need to own that. And I'll say that I was like very, very lucky. Like my mom still says like horrifically homophobic things to me and my partner sometimes, but like we still love her, and like we try to, guide her sort of in the right path. And she actually has listened. Like it's kind of amazing, like the way that family members who are homophobic, sometimes they will say homophobic and they'll be awful, but then sometimes they'll actually like, in their own real way, like work through the pain, not that I think there should be pain, and like come out better on the other side, or different, or changed, or trying. So something that I would tell people is like, keep making your art. Like you're gonna have to come out eventually. Like please don't be one of those people who stays in the closet forever. Like it's not worth it. And yeah, and like don't be afraid to like meld the two things. Like I don't know, I feel like queerness sometimes, especially in the Northeast, is like a very white thing. Like there's a very white way to be queer, and like it's very different from like being queer, and for me, Mexican American. So yeah, it's like find your other queer Latino people and like be friends with them. Like you can be friends with white queer people too. A lot of them are great, but like don't let that just be your group, you know. And like people who are not Latinx and like white, you know, that also like obviously be friends with them too.
Yeah, I don't. I'm not going to quote Dan Savage either, but I don't necessarily. It's really hard for me to think about the whole like if it's going to get better, because I think, you know, sometimes in order for things to get better, you actually have to make some uncomfortable decisions to get yourself like. I think about this a lot because my family's back in New Mexico, and I definitely, you know, had come out to them probably in late teens, early 20s, and then, you know, moved out here, and our relationship could not be better. I think a good portion of it has to do with the fact that that distance kind of helps. But one of the things that I discovered in the time since is that as young artists, that the thing that makes you most interesting isn't the sounding like everyone else. It's always sounding like yourself. It's always owning whatever narrative you have at that moment. And that's changing. That narrative is going to change many times as you change, and as your point of view changes, and as your sense of what your identity is changes. But that's the stuff that's going to make you interesting to anybody anyways. I think the mistake that I've seen from a lot of young writers especially is that they see the work that's out there in the world and they think, oh, I need to emulate that. So I'll give an example for myself is that I remember I was working on an adaptation of a play, and I set it intentionally in New Jersey amongst the Puerto Rican community, because even though I wanted to place the story in Albuquerque with the kind of older Hispano community I knew, I was like, I've never seen a play done in Albuquerque. Who's going to watch that? Nobody. They'll watch stuff out about New York or New Jersey or LA. So that's what I got to do. And I remember I presented to a mentor of mine both plays, right? Just like kind of just the introduction to both of these plays. And he was like, what is this? What is this New Jersey thing? And I was like, well, I just felt like, and he was like, no, don't do that. And he was like, first of all, it doesn't even sound right. You don't know anything about Puerto Ricans in New Jersey. He's not wrong. And he's like, but like the other piece sounds so, there's something about it that feels so real and so, and you know, I'm not saying you can only write out of your own experience, but that's what makes you interesting anyways. That story is so uniquely yours. And I can only say this out of my own personal like journey, is the only way that each step of my journey has been able to kind of, I've been able to find that next step, is because I laid seeds sometimes along the way that were all about who I am, right? That I was always thinking about at that moment, like, who am I, and where do I come from, and you know, you do this when you're applying for graduate programs, you do this when you're applying for grants, you do this all the time. Honing that narrative is what's going to set you apart, right? Thinking of how do I hone this narrative of who I am, and that actually means really, again, kind of go back to my earlier point, standing for who you are, standing up and taking the voice and the space that you need to take, because it's very easy to sort of want to blend in order to think that's what's going to get you ahead, but it's not. You're going to be the thing that people are going to want. They're going to want you and your story and your individual experience. That's not to say that's going to make you successful. I have no idea how people get successful in this field. That's a whole other conversation. But I think in terms of being an artist, that's the stuff I'm most drawn to as a dramaturg. That's the stuff you can kind of see when you hear someone's individual voice. You go like, that's it. I think that's the only thing that in the long run is going to save us, is being able to just speak our own truths. I think as Latinx or queer people or anything else, is speaking your own truth is not just about speaking to other people your truth. It's many times speaking it back to yourself. And that helps you keep refining and defining yourself in the process.
So we're talking about kind of owning our own narratives, and I know for a lot of Latin artists that involves either Catholicism, Christianity, or a break from that tradition. So I know you both come from religious backgrounds, so I'm wondering how that has colored your work, like how that influences what you bring to the table.
Do you mind if I take this one first? I'll start with this one. So I grew up in a family that's evangelical Pentecostal. My dad was a minister for a period of time growing up. We are not just like, we're going to preach the gospel to you. We were the type that would also protest gay pride marches, like pretty intense people. And what I've found, well, first of all, this goes back to what I was just saying about narrative, is that it has been one of the things that I have been able to, it took me a long time to realize that I definitely wanted to run away from that. I needed to step away from it. It was destructive to who I was as a queer person. It was also, it's just destructive overall. Like I found there were people in my family who find peace and solace and understanding and all of that. It did not provide that for me. It provides confusion and frustration for me. But that said, what it also provided for me was that my church, in their evangelical bent, believed that you try to save people in any means possible. And so we did a lot of like devised theater. We would do shows about drug life and people who would come to Jesus, and we would stage them. We would travel across the Southwest doing these plays on blacktops and doing these plays in like in government housing communities. And we were basically doing site-specific work. I would call that now. We also created the Hell House, the idea of like people going into, like that was our invention in the early 80s. And so I was starting to write and direct those and act in them. I think the last time I acted, I played a school shooter. True. And so I bring all that up because on one hand, when I moved out here, one of the things is I was like, that was my previous life. That is not who I am. I refuse to believe that. That is not the kind of point of view in which I have. But that also built who I am. That is all of those things now. When I think of immersive theater, I'm like, oh, we did that. We did immersive theater. We got that. We did sites. We did devised work. We did, and now I just have more of an academic relationship to it. But I also have this like emotional relationship to it that really informs every bit of how I think of audience, every bit of how I think of the relationship between the performer and their work, and how does that really speak to the people that are in that audience at that moment. And that is actually part of my story. It is not where I sit anymore. And for a long time, I wanted to run away from that and have that as my separate life back in New Mexico, not who I am anymore. But what I've realized is that that is an essential part of who I am at this moment. It frames where my theatrical energy comes from and where I kind of like started building these roots early on. It also frames how I think of audience to this day. And it does change my relationship with my family still. They actually can track why I am in theater. They don't love it, but they can understand why. They saw me doing that and being very, and loving all of that and being pretty effective in it when I was younger. So it kind of makes sense why I'm doing it. But I would say like the way that now I engage, I actually still struggle with how to engage with, I was just talking to my therapist about this week, how I deal with religion in the world at this moment in my life. It is a challenge for me. And I guess the only thing I can come to right at this moment is like, it provides meaning for people in my life. It does not provide meaning, but it did define a lot for me. And I still use those definitions to this day. The one minor thing I will say is that evangelical Christianity, like the Pentecostal Protestant version, basically created a version of culture that kind of flattened and whitened everything in my family. So my dad comes from a very large family. That my grandmother had 10 kids. And my grandmother was very much hardcore Catholic, raised all of her kids to be Catholics. And within their like family, they have songs that are tied to, they sing De Colores, and it's something they would sing at church, and they also would sing for fun. And I didn't grow up with it. And so I'm realizing that that's one thing that I kind of I kind of am sorrowful for, and that is that I kind of didn't get to experience, as much as I don't necessarily want to be Catholic, there was at least some ties to culture that I just don't share because of the flattening, the like body of Christ, which happens to seem very white when you're in an evangelical background.
Yeah. Catholic guilt is real. I was raised Catholic, and I'm sort of in a similar place with religion where I'm like a little bit more anti-religious than I want to be sometimes. Like I want to, be okay with people doing, like practicing whatever religion they want. I'm like happy with it, but I struggle with it a lot personally. Like I think spirituality is very important, but in terms of organized religion, it's hard for me not to see the negatives of it overshadowing the positives in sort of society and in culture, especially in America right now. Like the way that religion is sort of utilized in this sort of evil way. And I know that's not like what actually organized religion is, but a lot of those people, there is overlap, unfortunately. And I think I experienced that a lot growing up in a Mexican Catholic household, like what you were saying, James, like there is a lot of culture there. Like Mexican Catholicism is very different from like American Catholicism, and like the celebrations, the rituals, the prayers, all of that super different, and a lot of it is really beautiful. Like so I struggle with it, I like if anyone, like for anyone watching this, if you know my play mamawa at all, it's like I still sometimes feel like the Virgin Mary is gonna like whisper in God's ear and be like, you gotta smite this like young queer Mexican kid because he's doing this horrible shit to me on stage. And it's like, I don't know, it's like this weird thing where I am very attracted to the mythology of it, and I find the stories like very interesting. And something about Christianity is that like a lot of our cultural stories, at least in the West, I'm like mostly in the West, are formed by sort of the Jesus myth and like sort of this idea of a Messiah and a savior. So like in college as an English major, I felt like I had a leg up on so many people because like people were like, there's like religious themes in this, and it's like, actually you're wrong, like that's not actually how that story works. And I'm glad that you thought so, but that's not how it works. Like I went to Catholic school. So like as a storyteller, I'm very grateful for that upbringing in a way, even though like personally it can be really hard sometimes. And like my mom still doesn't want to read my manhwa, which is totally fine. It's like not about her, but it is a coming out story between like a young man and his mother. So like I think she feels like it's too intense, which like I totally respect. But like the idea that she, like who she thinks that she is in the play, even though it's not her, like kills a priest in the end, is like truly horrific to her. So all to say, like super big part of my identity, super big part of my art, I think. I think usually like my Mexican characters mention Catholicism at least like once in whatever play I'm doing, and it's just like it sort of just naturally happens. And I think I associate Catholicism, for better or worse, with like conservatism, which like it's not, but like there are liberal Catholics, so it's complicated. So I think it's hard for me to, I don't know, take it in as a thing that I can currently practice in my life. And I don't think I'll ever really go back to organized religion as something in my life. But I'm glad in a sort of twisted way that I was raised Catholic, because it does give me a lot of fuel to sort of rage against something that I find unjust, and like that did actually cause me a lot of pain growing up. Like being queer and Catholic is really hard. But like my mom, like my middle name is Sebastián, that's what I go by. But like he is like the most homoerotic saint in like all the pantheon. So like she knew what she was doing, even if she didn't. And I kind of love that whole mythology and sort of twisting Catholicism on its head, and like what can you do with these myths that we uphold, that Catholics uphold, and that are so Mexican. Like Mexican Catholicism is interesting to me, and a lot of it is really beautiful to me. Like American Catholicism, less so. Like, I don't know, like the little Easter lamb, like cake, like it's cute, but it's, I don't know. And I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, I would say one other thing too that I've been really working through with this idea, and you were hitting on this idea of the myths and the value of myths, is that it is so embedded in our culture. I think there are a lot of myths embedded in our culture that we just don't realize. Like a good simple one that's not necessarily biblical, of course, but like Romeo and Juliet, you could ask a bunch of junior high school students what it's about. They may never have read it or seen it, but they could be like, oh yeah, it's this person and this person, and they know enough of the like basic premise, and that's sort of how the myths have functioned for so long. And so many of those, I would say, Judeo-Christian myths sort of are spread throughout society, and I would say are even deeper within Latinx communities. And so in a weird way, they can be a very strong way to shortcut conversation, to really get deep into some ideas just by using myths in an effective way. So I think as storytellers, it is something that's very valuable. Actually, religion shows up in a lot of my work in the same way because it is so essential to who I am. But the final piece of that I would say is religion has provided something to me that's very important, which is it has provided for me the one thing I've only since really grasped this, but the real reason I love theater, and this moment is a good example of this. The real reason I love theater is because it is a group of people coming together with a singular purpose. And there's technically two groups of people. You have the audience, of course, but you also have these artists who are coming together to create this thing. And that is the one thing I really value and miss about the religious experience, or at least that practice of it. As much as I do still kind of bristle at organized religion, I do miss the organization in some ways. I do miss an audience. I'm struggling in this moment to like enjoy watching plays on computers because I'm realizing one of my favorite things is hearing other people respond to something in the same moment, or respond differently from me, or and that is something that I really miss from the religious experiences, that kind of communal approach. And that's why I think, growing up, my parents were insistent I was going to be a minister. And I actually think my work right now is a form of ministry. I think, there's a lot of crossover. I'm still working with, a group of people that really want to come together with the same purpose, that want to change the world somehow, that want to present myths in a really beautiful way and reframe them for new audiences all the time. And so I think there's a value of it, not just for us Latinx people, but even though for us, we have it embedded in a different way sometimes. But really, for me as an artist, I do feel enriched by a lot of the concepts and the core ideas of organized religion, even if I don't follow a specific path at this moment.
All right, we have time for one more question, and I want to touch on this because I loved what you both had to say about it when we had our planning meeting. So colorism is a big issue in Latin communities and in Latinx theater. What have your experiences been with colorism in your careers, and how can we combat that in our work?
Yeah, so sort of going back to, well, first of all, I'll say, like, obviously I am very like white passing, white presenting, whatever you want to call it. I use white passing. So in a way, I think colorism has affected me in a sort of positive way, which is kind of a messed up way of phrasing that sentence, but it's true. Like when people want someone who's Latinx in the room, like I am I feel like for white institutions, sometimes that is the easier or like safer choice, or like the one that feels less different, while also still ticking the box for that. So in terms of how I combat it in my personal life, I think it's something sort of going back to this idea that I was talking about, how do we focus our own energy to create change? I think it's always a conversation that I talk through with myself in my plays of like when I'm writing Latinx characters, I always have in my head like, okay, is this like a specifically like, is this specifically a track for like someone with darker skin, or can it be like any Latinx person, or does it have to be someone who is more white passing? Like that's something that I think about in my own work a lot. And also I also think about it when I'm talking to directors and like casting directors, or like when people talk to me about like, how do you want to cast this? I try to be very explicit and advocate for the fact that like, I want these actors to be Latinx, but I don't want them all to look, just like slightly tan white people, like, because that's like those people are usually who are casted. Like, I mean, if we watch any telenovela, like on anything, like usually like very white looking people in these roles. And like even if we look at a lot of like the famous like Latinx artists in America right now, a lot of them are you know, more on the wider side of the scale in terms of skin tone. So yeah, it's complicated. It's something that I don't know. It's complicated, and it's something that I have been thinking about lately. I'm thinking about it a lot lately, and it's also different, I think, depending on where you are in the United States. Like in San Diego, I never really thought about it because I was always just like I was just Mexican. Like it was obvious. Like there were a lot of people who looked at me. There were a lot of people who didn't look like me, but we were all Latinx and it was fine. We all spoke Spanish. And like out here in the Northeast, with the fact that there are less Latinx people, it feels like there sometimes is a microscope of like who should be getting these opportunities, who should be getting these roles, like what voices do we uplift? And sometimes I think it's not always like the right way. Like it's not always the right person who's being uplifted. Like sometimes I think the easier route is chosen, and I think sometimes I am the easier route, which it's its own like sort of fucked up thing about the American theater. So yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things that kind of almost like piggybacking on what you were saying about like who we are, and in this moment, I mean, obviously I too pass as like white, and so that helps in a lot of ways. But I'm also like not on stage, right? So a lot of this conversation isn't just about this is a field that's about visual representation. It is a visual medium, and it is problematic that we don't necessarily always have access to the ability the ability to like cast a group of people. So what becomes problematic is that we have limited imagination sometimes on the sides of casting directors or directors in general, who when they say, oh, I think how I see this character, they're only seeing a very slim version of what this character can be. And you know, that's not something necessarily that we can change unless we're in that room, but it is something that we can like do our best to always advocate for. When you're in a place, like when I can talk about like being in a similar situation, because I was an associate as well, you can kind of get yourself eventually, when you're comfortable and you figure out the language of the place, to be able to like acknowledge the problems of that, to acknowledge internally, like, why are we doing this again? Why is this, you know, why is this casting done this way? And so when you can take that space, you definitely should. And I would say this also equally as like theater makers, when we're making small works, when we're trying out, you know, just getting something staged with some friends and like being able to figure out a way to do that, I think is essential to acknowledge that our lightness or whiteness still comes with its own version of privilege that's going to maybe let us get into certain doors in a different way. And so in that process, acknowledging what that means, we lift up the voices that we can. But one of the things I want to kind of touch on, which is I think something we did talk about previously, is that a lot of times what we're talking about is a sliver of a sliver, right? I mean, I was looking at the 2018-2019 season in Boston, just like doing a survey of all the theaters out there. And I think you can count on one hand, out of what is like 50 shows or whatever, considering all the major theaters, one hand how many Latinx plays were on stage. And that's unfortunate. I mean, and what we're talking about in this instance many times isn't just there was a Latinx play on stage. It was a Latinx play or a play with a Latinx playwright that hopefully maybe had a Latinx cast, not always has a Latinx director. Like there's a lot of choices within that sometimes it feels like what we're fighting for in terms of uplifting the voices or uplifting, you know, people who who aren't as white as us, is that we're fighting for this tiny little, you know, slice of land. They're like, how do we just get any Latinx voices heard at all, right? And so I want to, on one hand, acknowledge the value and the importance, the absolute value of acknowledging what we see everywhere, but we see in advertisements aimed towards Latinx people, or even towards like Black people or anyone else, it's always lighter skin wins somehow, right? So if we can acknowledge that and then do our best in our small way to question that and to acknowledge the problems with that and then start pushing things in a different direction, great. On the other hand, I want us to like be like, oh yeah, this is also just, we have very little land to walk on at this moment. And I'll be completely honest, I want to elevate as many Latinx voices in general as I can, but that's because I work on the writing end. I don't work on the casting end. So this conversation many times is about who gets to represent what story on stage. And at this moment in my life, I don't have the ability to change that. I can only change it in the way that I can at this moment. So I think it's valuable when you're saying that as like a writer, because as a writer, there are times in which you can acknowledge that like, oh, this should be only played by, and this is one of the things that is very new in American theater. But playwrights are explicitly writing into their work, this should only be played by a Latinx character, a dark-skinned Latinx. Like that stuff is incredibly valuable. And that is stuff that on my end, I do encourage playwrights to do. A lot of playwrights will be like, well, I don't really care. And then I'll give them like the worst case scenario. I'll be like, okay, so then you're saying you want Maria, whatever, could be played by, a white girl from Oklahoma. He's no. Well, then you've got to be specific. Be very clear in your script what you don't want. Say what you want and say what you don't want. And a lot of, I would say we get afraid to like do that. But that's, again, the slight ways in which we can change something, take the ground that you can. And I think that's one way you can do it as a playwright, at least. That's my dramaturgical point of view, at least.
Yeah, I personally always get frustrated when I read a play without, unless, I hate when they're not specific about, 3 characters and just very specific about 1 character. Sometimes that works, but most of the time it's just, these characters are white, so I don't have to be specific. And, this character is not white, so I don't have to be specific. So, I also, always try to be very specific about who these people are. Because I also think, if you're not doing that, then you're doing a disservice to the character in the play because they are navigating that world in whatever body that they are in. So I don't know. I just found that very interesting, and I'm glad that it's becoming more of a thing in scripts.
Yeah, me too.
All right, we have to wrap up, but is there anything that you want to leave our audience with? So that's students, educators, theater artists who are either new to this conversation, who haven't had a lot of experience talking about equity in theater, or people who have been doing this work in their time in school. Is there anything that you want to leave off with?
I'll just say briefly, I mean, this moment is really interesting that we're in. Obviously, I feel like that's such a cliche. Every commercial is saying that right now. And in a way, this is probably, I can say just for myself, it has been one of the best times for me to be able to take a moment to survey the landscape in a way that I haven't been able to do before. For those of us who work regularly in the theater, and in my case, I'm an educator primarily and the critic on the side, which means I'm seeing a lot of work and I'm constantly engaging with work. It is interesting to not be seeing the same level of work, but then it's allowed me to take a step back and really look at the communities that are being built or the work that could be done. And I've been able to read playwrights that I've never read and found ways, and I've been able to access people in different ways and create connections. Because this moment, we still want connections somehow, we just don't know how it is. And this is, in some ways, the best way to do it that is not being forced upon us, like when we normally would just walk into a theater and whatever audience is there, that's the audience we're connecting with at that moment. This is a moment where we can be intentional about it a little bit. And I think it can give us a little bit of room to be able to start to see what other voices are out there and how do we elevate those, or how do we talk alongside each other. Like this is a great example of this. We were going to do a version of a panel, but this is the way in which we've actually figured out to narrow the scope of this conversation. And I think that's exciting because that's allowing us to start thinking about these. I haven't really thought about this or needed to in my own capacity or had these conversations in my own capacity with other queer Latinx people. Just hasn't happened, unfortunately. So it's exciting that this moment is not only encouraging it and facilitating it, but I think it allows us to take a little bit of a moment, a breather, to be able to hopefully start making more of those connections, and seeing what's out there. And then hopefully whenever the next step is, wherever we go after this moment, we are a little bit more connected and a little bit more able to fight the battle together, rather than being this like solo voice in Boston, or feeling that like that's what it is, which, you know, that's sort of how I felt for a very long time, being in a large institutional theater. And so I think I would just encourage people to like live in this moment as much as we can. It's very hard, but utilize it in a way, if you can, to like find new people, find your people, but new people.
I love that. And I agree so much with that. Something that I have found so kind of incredible about this moment is I haven't had an MFA yet, and I didn't study theater in undergrad. So like I don't really have like a formal like training in terms of playwriting, at least, which is fine. Like I don't lament it. Like I'm figuring it out in my own way. And then one day I hope to get an MFA, and I feel like I will be all the better for it. But something that I have been doing a lot is like taking advantage of these free like Zoom classes that a lot of like leaders in the industry are doing right now, that like can range from, you know, like Lynn Nottage did like something about meditation. Like it wasn't even about playwriting, and she was like, don't ask me about playwriting, like I'm not going to answer it. And just like these ways that we are finding the time to connect, and also to take a break a little bit, and like you were saying, James, like sort of assess the landscape. But I think taking a break is really important. I think theater is a very theater is an awesome industry, but it also works you to the bone sometimes for like very little money and like very little breaks. So I think for some people, not for everyone, like a lot of people lost a lot of opportunity and jobs too, but in a way, if we can find a way to take this as a much needed break to like regenerate in a way, like our energy and just like what we know and what we think about the theater, I think that is important. And obviously not everyone can do that. Like some people have had COVID affect their lives in a much more personal way. I have been very lucky so far, like knock on wood, that like it hasn't infiltrated my immediate circle. But just to say, yeah, like the flip side of that is like, don't beat yourself up if you can't do the work right now. Like I think for like 2 months, I was like beating myself up every day of being like, you need to be writing, like you have more time now, like you don't commute, you don't do this. And I think accepting that actually we're all going through something very, very difficult right now, like that is bigger than our field, that sort of affects the whole world, is really important and humbling and helpful to me as a person as well as a theater artist.
Thank you both for being here. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now, but thank you so much. I loved having you, and thank you so much for taking time out of your day to speak with me.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.